In today's episode, an elderly exotic animal sanctuary owner steps into his pet lion's den to show off for some tourists. Upon entering the lion enclosure, he is quickly pounced on by the lion in a predatory attack. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying lion attack on Mike Hodge. Welcome to Final Affliction. Mike Hodge and his wife Chrissy moved to South Africa 30 years ago, all to pursue Mike's passion for the magnificent African wildlife. Mike specialized in the most fearsome of them all, the mighty African lion. In less than 10 years, Mike and Chrissy overhauled their little oasis in the bush into a sanctuary where injured lions, abandoned cubs, and a fair number of other wildlife found their permanent home. Marakele Animal Sanctuary wasn't just known for its game drives and regular old African safari-style entertainment. Mike and Chrissy had lions, cheetahs, and leopards right in the heart of the property. Some of the animals brought in were so injured when they were found that they'd never survive on their own in the wild. But thanks to Mike and Chrissy, they were held in massive enclosures so that they could live long and healthy lives as close to their original environments as possible. Mike was never in the business of raising circus animals who'd do backflips for a treat. He understood the nature of a wild animal better than anyone. Even the cubs that they raised by hand were never left alone with other humans. And whenever Mike or his staff entered an enclosure, even as friendly as the lions were, someone always had a loaded hunting rifle at the ready, just in case. And for the more sensitive of our viewers, this rather extreme precaution amongst seemingly tame kittens was what ultimately saved Mike's life. His playful cats that he'd fed in the night and raised on his lap were never underestimated, and guests were allowed to view them but never feed or interact personally with the predators, just like it would have been in the wild. The only real difference here was that the cats were supplied food by the staff, and with the high fence line, visitors could view them closer than they would have on a game drive out in the wild. Shamba, the biggest of Mike's captive lions, was the main attraction for everyone. He was found as the lone surviving cub of his litter, his mother probably killed by another predator. Between Mike and Chrissy, they fed Shamba bottles by hand and allowed him to sleep on their laps so that he wouldn't mewl and cry in the night for his lost siblings and mother. Mike liked to entertain visitors by going into Shamba's enclosure and feeding him by hand, and showing them how the mighty beast loved a scratch behind the ears. This was exactly the case on May 2nd, 2018. Mike and his wife were now in their early 70s, and at a time when most people would have long since retired, they were still going strong and accepting more guests than ever. Chrissy had received a group of 3 married couples, all in their late 30s, from America the night before. The group were planning on spending the next 2 days exploring the reserve and shaking off their jet lag. After a good night's sleep, Mike and his best tour guide, Lubanzi, took the group out bright and early. Lubanzi noticed that Shamba was not his usual self, and the guide, an expert in his field, thought he knew what it was. Inside Shamba's enclosure there was the unmistakable musk left behind by a badger. Apparently, the ferocious little beast had gotten into the lion's space the night before and left its scent everywhere that it could reach. Lubanzi used Shamba's breakfast to keep the lion's attention occupied elsewhere so that he could try to find the badger. But apparently the animal had gone off to find someone else to terrorize. He reported his suspicions to Mike, but besides Shamba being a little on edge, there wasn't much else they could do until they caught and relocated the badger. They drove the armored jeep, spotting out the various bucks, elephants, and even a herd of zebras. The morning was everything that an African safari promised to be on the brochures. After a quick lunch under the canopy of the trees, the group was taken to the fenced-in enclosures where the permanent rescues stayed, starting with a pair of springbuck babies that were being fed milk from handheld bottles. They worked their way up to the more exotic creatures, including 2 cheetahs and a mean-tempered serval cat who wasn't willing to come out to greet them. They ended the ride with a visit to Shamba's enclosure, where Mike got out and confidently entered through the high gates. Lubanzi followed, his rifle slung over his shoulder, as was protocol. The couples had been eagerly awaiting this part of the trip all day. Shamba's reputation was legendary, and Mike's handling of him was nothing short of awe-inspiring. Unlike every other visit, Shamba did not bound over to Mike with excitement. Instead, he had his nose on the ground, still sniffing at the musk that last night's intruder had left behind. When Mike walked up to him, Shamba didn't see his old friend. He was in the throes of being territorial. He was defensive and already poised for a fight. Shamba just leapt at him, and Mike recognized immediately that the growls in the sudden spring was uncharacteristic. He bolted for the gate as fast as his geriatric legs could carry him. Had he been a few years younger, he'd have made it the short distance to the gate. But he was not a young man anymore. Shamba outstripped him almost instantly, ramming full force into Mike just as he reached out for the gate. The American started screaming in panic and fear. Lubanzi, on the other hand, had his rifle out and at the ready before Mike even reached the gate. He didn't dare fire at Shamba just yet, for fear of hitting Mike. Shamba hooked the elderly man with his claws, pulled Mike away from the gate that he was hanging onto for dear life, and dragged him across the ground. Mike went limp, not because fear had incapacitated him, but because he knew better than to put up a fight. If he reacted now, Shamba would retaliate to any sudden movement with murderous finality. So despite the burning pain in his jaw and the searing wounds on his back, Mike allowed himself to be dragged like a rag doll a few feet away, not even daring to yell out in pain. If he could scream, it would have been to tell the tourists to keep quiet. Their terrified yells and one of the women's hysterical crying was surely driving Shamba to even greater fury. The explosion of noise was just adding to the chaos. Lubanzi fired a round into the air, and Shamba was shaken out of his moment of madness for just long enough to let go of Mike. And still, Mike didn't move, but neither did Shamba. He stood over Mike like a predator guarding a kill, ready to square off with whoever fired the round. Lubanzi didn't need to take a second to decide. With Mike on the ground and finally out of Shamba's jaws, this was going to be the only chance Lubanzi had to save his boss's life. A second of hesitation was all that Shamba needed to finish Mike off, so Lubanzi fired the second round, hitting Shamba squarely in the chest. The lion bounded back from Mike, running around in a half circle, thoroughly confused at the sting in his chest, not realizing that he was mortally wounded. But the damage was done. The lion, now mad with pain, added to its already uncontrollable territorial instinct. It was a time bomb waiting to happen. Lubanzi took a moment to see if Mike was even still alive, but Mike was lying still as death. He turned back and fired 2 more shots. Shamba stumbled a few feet backwards, reeling from the blast, and fell dead on the ground. With the screams and yells still ringing in his ears, Lubanzi stepped into the enclosure, his rifle still raised in case Shamba wasn't as dead as he seemed, while another guide ran in after him and dragged Mike out by his armpits. Miraculously, Mike was conscious, and he even directed his staff on calling emergency services and on how to evacuate the traumatized tourists. To them, Mike looked like he was at death's door. The man was bleeding profusely from the grooves left by Shamba's claws in his back, and his jaw was very clearly broken. It was a wonder that Mike could even manage to talk. He was airlifted to Johannesburg within the hour, while Chrissy drove the couples to a local hotel. The visitors wanted nothing more than to get away from the sanctuary after their ordeal. Mike, accompanied by Lubanzi and his stepdaughter, waited all day to see him out of surgery. Mike, like he always had, just powered through it all. Besides his jaw being broken in 2 places from being rammed into the metallic gate, he had a dozen scratches that required more than 100 stitches. You'd think that Mike would call it a day and finally retire, but no. The Hodge family are still there, rescuing and raising the very predators that nearly took Mike's life. If anything, the sanctuary, the Hodges, and the staff mourned the loss of Shamba. They'd seen him grow up before their eyes, and they knew better than anyone that a wild animal will always be just that, wild. No one blamed Shamba, but Lubanzi did blame himself. He's never quite gotten over killing the king of the jungle. As thankful as he was that Mike could live to save another animal, he can't stop replaying the memory of Shamba's terrifying final affliction.